to our talk today. Thank you for braving the unpredictable weather that we've had all day, from thunderstorms to rain clouds. Let me just not cover our star speaker tonight. So for those of you who haven't been here before, we're the Yunus Emre Institute. We're essentially Turkey's cultural diplomacy institute, where we aim to introduce Turkey's culture and language to whatever host country we're in. We run conferences, concerts, and events, including this one. Tonight, we have a Young Scholars Seminar. During this series, we essentially try to platform our scholars and young academics so they can essentially, introduce their research and their fascinating topics. Tonight, we're delving into 13th, 14th century Iran with Yusuf Chaudhary. So thank you, and take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, firstly, to the Yunus Emre Institute for inviting me to do this talk. As you can see from my title, I am a researcher, historian, Cambridge, currently in my second year of my PhD, researching intellectual networks and the intellectual history of Mongol Iran, with a focus on the two cities, the two somewhat capital cities of Mongol Iran, Marāghah and Tabrīz. So I imagine many of you might have heard of Tabriz, but don't know necessarily where Marāghah is. So without further ado, there's a map here. As you can see, this is the Mongol Empire, which many of you may be familiar with, like hearing about Genghis Khan and Hulagu Khan and the conquest of Baghdad and all of these other sorts of horrible things about the Mongols and destruction and war and things like that. They created one of the largest contiguous land empires, the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from East China all the way to Eastern Europe there. What I focus on is the Ilkhanate, the portion or the part of the greater Mongol Empire in Iran. So it's this one here, with a focus on the two cities, Marāghah and Tabriz, here in Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani region of Iran. Let's go closer into the Ilkhanate now. This is the territory of the Ilkhanate. And here you can see Tabriz and Marāghah here with a few other cities. You can see it stretches all the way from Afghanistan. Here's Kabul, Ghazna, all the way onto the Sultanate of Rum, which was a Mongol vassal state for about 50 or so years. So what my research, well, before I actually go into what I've been looking at in the Mongol Empire, I'd firstly let's talk about some of the current historical perspectives on the Mongols. Unlike what's well known or appears to be well known in popular history about the destruction and the damage and the brutality and the intellectual decline and stagnation that was brought about by Mongols, there are many books and articles or TV series that I can think of that talk about things or mention things like this. In current academic scholarship, there's a very different view of the Mongols. Firstly, there's a difference between Genghis Khan's invasion of Iran in 1219, going up to 1223, and the consolidation of Mongol rule about 30 years later with the Ilkhanate, which is what we're going to look at today. So while the brutality that everyone remembers or everyone reads about regarding the Mongol conquests happened in the first wave of the Mongol conquest with Genghis Khan's invasion. Whereas the consolidation of Mongol rule in Ilkhanate is actually being appreciated as instigating a vibrant period of cultural exchange, intellectual developments, flourishing literary production, with what some academics have called a Persian Renaissance, where Persian literature in poetry and historical writing really takes like flourishes and becomes extremely sophisticated. Many of the poets, that famous Persian poets, Sa'di, Hafiz, they all were alive and subjects of the Ilkhanate, for example, subjects of both non-Muslim. They're considered like quintessential Muslim Persian poets. For a great period of their life, they were subjects of non-Muslim Mongol rulers. But I've added this last point here, that while the picture that you might be getting, that I'm presenting, you might be considering, am I trying to say that nothing bad was happened during the period of Mongol rule in Iran? This is not total revisionism, as one scholar, David Morgan, said, but it's a call for balance and differentiation, appreciating what really happened during the period of Mongol rule, and trying to bring to light some of the really fascinating intellectual and cultural developments during this period in the 13th and 14th century. Another aspect of what I look at is what's called post-classical Islamic intellectual history, or post-classical philosophy in the Islamic world, which is really from the 13th century onwards, which from about prior to the 90s, although it still remains in some academic circles, is considered that intellectual output in the Islamic world suffers a period of stagnation and decline, with the production of, like, most scholars writing commentaries, lack of original output. However, recently in the academic world, this idea of intellectual stagnation has really been challenged, and also the notion of this idea of a golden age of Islam and then this decline until you get to the modern world. But because of the challenge to this decline paradigm, the period from the 13th century onwards has become really a relative terra incognita. It's the numerous avenues available for scholars now that you've kind of swept away this old paradigm, and to fill it, there's almost innumerable avenues that an academic or a scholar could look at, a historian could look at in the period. So that's kind of the current historical perspective on the period. Now, getting into the Ilkhanate itself, the establishment of the Ilkhanate under Mongol rule, under the ruler Hulagu, which some of you might be familiar with, the first ruler of the Ilkhanate. In 1258, he besieged Baghdad. Now, I won't go into all of the details of the siege of Baghdad. I imagine some of you may be familiar, readily available in many books and in popular history. But one of the claims that I found that really got me into studying this period is the fact that when I started to look into the history, I noticed that this claim of the Mongols destroying all of the books, you've heard of this phrase, the claim that the Mongols burnt the libraries and threw the books of Baghdad into the river such that it was running black with ink and red with blood. Well, I've found out that this doesn't really seem to be true, at least not from the sources that are available from us, the most contemporary sources and the most reliable ones. In fact, the claims of systematic book destruction, as it says, appears about 150 years after the Ilkhanate, as contemporaries, including anti-Mongol contemporaries, write that about 40,000 volumes were transported to the city Marāghah from Baghdad by the Shi'i polymath and philosopher Naṣīr al-Ṭūsī. In fact, even stranger than that, to kind of prove the point that the libraries didn't really get destroyed, is that all of the libraries were still in use well after the Mongols, and the Mongols still employed librarians. Why would you need librarians if there are no more books? But after the Siege of Baghdad, which did suffer a huge loss in its population and in its intellectual environment, what we have is not necessarily a case of intellectual decline of the city, but intellectual centers moving from Baghdad to other regions. And this is where the cities of Tabriz, Marāghah and Tabrīz come in. So Marāghah is the site of a very famous observatory in the medieval period, which was built by Naṣīr al-Ṭūsī, who I just mentioned, the philosopher, mathematician and astronomer, who's really a polymath, who built it with the permission of the Ilkhan Hulagu, populating it with about 500 displaced families from around Iraq, the Arab lands, Iran, that had really been in exile or emigrated after the initial Mongol conquest. He was joined by a few famous philosophers. These names are familiar to people who are engaged in medieval philosophy or medieval Islamic philosophy and logic and astronomy. Najmuddin al-Katibi, Mu'ayyaduddin al-Urdi, and Muhyiddin al-Maghribi, and many others, as I said, like these 500 or so families. The establishment of this observatory led to the development of what has been called the Marāghah school of Avicennan philosophy, in which scholars the scholars around Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī began to comment on Ibn Sina's philosophy, and also write what they called adjudications, muhakamat, between commentators, earlier commentators of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, such as al-Rāzi and Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī, where they would have these two intellectual heavyweights of Islamic philosophy and their opposing views on Ibn Sina's philosophy and their interpretations of Ibn Sina, and they would adjudicate and judge between them in terms and try and argue for who they think won. Very philosophical, deep philosophical discussions. As for Tabriz as the administrative center of the Ilkhanate became populated by many intellectuals coming for a number of reasons: patronage, intellectual opportunities, meeting other scholars, and other such things. But the existence of both of these cities, firstly, it tells us about the development of new intellectual circles and intellectual centers, but also it shows the continuity of intellectual transmission in the period. And one of the sources that I use to examine this is a biographical dictionary by the historian and traditionist from Baghdad, Ibn al-Fuwati. Now, Ibn al-Fuwati was captured during the conquest of Baghdad, imprisoned, and was freed by Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī, who, because he was well versed in the library collections of Baghdad, Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī freed him and took him to Marāghah when setting up the observatory. Now, Ibn al-Fuwati's biographical dictionary is the only surviving biographical dictionary from Ilkhanate Iran known to us, which has over 6,000, close to 6,000 rather, notices in its excellent portion, which covers the letters from Ain to Mim in the Arabic language. Now, that would, if you take that, that would place maybe the full collection at around 30,000 entries, I think, which makes it one of the biggest biographical dictionaries in Islamic history. It's quite valuable then as a source. If only we had the rest of the letters, it would be quite special. But unfortunately, despite this, and despite the fact that this biographical dictionary has been published for over 20 years now, over 25 years, there's not been a single systematic study of it in the academic world, despite its potential value and use. There have been a few articles here and there, but until until my research, at least as far as I'm aware, no systematic study of it for its content on Ilkhanate Iran. A biographical dictionary is essentially an entry of a dictionary of biographies, which here's just one of the examples of an entry. They're organized by laqab, which is what makes this unusual rather than someone's name. They're organized by one's title. In this case, Minhajul Din, or the path of the religion, or the way of the religion. Then you've got his name, Abu Abdullah Muhammad, with his kunya, the father of Abdullah, with his name Muhammad. And a nisba at the end, the geographic adjective, al-Bukhari here, which shows that he's from Bukhara. And then finally his occupation, al-Katib al-Muharrir, which is, seems to have been a scribe. Now I chose this one as an example because of the fact that he's from Bukhara. Now those of you who have read up on your Mongol history before might have read that Bukhara was completely razed to the ground by Chinggis Khan and his army invading armies in the beginning of the 13th century. Well, this is quite interesting that this individual comes actually from Bukhara during the Ilkhanate period and becomes a maths teacher in Tabriz. So he becomes a maths teacher in Tabriz, teaching children actually in a small maktab, a small school. And this entry says that he had a very good life in Tabriz until something seems to have happened to him, and he went to Marāghah in the year 664 of the Hijri calendar, and sought from Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī to write to the finance minister Shamsuddin al-Juwayni, explaining his situation and possibly providing him some help. So this is an example of one of the entries in the dictionary where you can see the nisba, the geographic adjective that gives us some insight into the origins of the individuals present in Marāghah and Tabrīz, through which we can create a map that looks something like this. Now this is a map of Marāghah with the geographic nisbas, the people present in Marāghah during the Ilkhanate period from about 1250 to 1334, and where they had come from, where they had come from in the Islamic world to arrive in Marāghah. This serves as a useful indication for us about what the cultural and social makeup of the Ilkhanate of these two Ilkhanate cities was like, about the cosmopolitan nature of these cities, where you can see people from as far as East Turkestan, someone coming from Kashgar in East Turkestan. You have individuals coming from the Mamluk realm. You have individuals coming from Georgia, modern day Georgia up here. You have only one, unfortunately, from modern day Turkey, Anatolia. While that's only one from there, this is just a map of the nisbas, which doesn't actually show you how many people actually came from each place. That would be too much to put on this map, unfortunately. There are about 300 entries in total for Marāghah and Tabriz. Naturally, people came from more proximate locations, but it's quite interesting showing the cosmopolitan nature of these two centers. So here's Tabriz as well. There are slightly fewer entries in Tabriz, particularly because Marāghah not only includes the city itself, but also mention of the observatory that was built in Marāghah. Tabriz, there's some overlap between them as well, but you can see similar things. So similar people, so closer to these centers, people are coming from closer to these centers. But again, you still have people from Bukhara and Kashgar coming to Tabriz as well. They're different people, I assure you. There's no duplicates on this map. But what type of who are the people that were coming to Tabriz and Marāghah? Well, I'll start with one that I find the most interesting. Kamaluddin Aflatun al-Hindi. The name, there's two, so al-Hindi from India, and his name was Aflatun, Plato. I don't know whether his parents chose to name him Plato or whether that's a name he took for himself, but he wasn't like his name, unfortunately. Ibn al-Fawati says that when he met him, although he was a nice enough person, he was not good at all in philosophy. In fact, he said that our master, the Naṣīr ad-Dīn, ordered me to write his lesson notes for him. And Ibn al-Fawati quipped, suppose I write his lesson notes for him, should I memorize them on his behalf as well? But he also serves as an interesting example of the effect of Mongol rule and the cultural effect of Mongol rule on the subjects in Iran. He would plait his beard, wear a woven outer garment and a Mongol hat. He would say incomprehensible things and mention points of juristic differences in Islamic law while looking like that. In fact, there's another entry that I remember of an individual who would entertain the Mongol rulers by saying things in Mongolian that he didn't understand and just like butchering the pronunciation and the grammar, and that would entertain the Mongol rulers, and they would probably give him some gifts or some money for being the court jester. So here's an example of someone who came to Marāghah and Tabrīz to study philosophy, but also you have individuals from those two cities who traveled around the rest of the Islamic world. So here you've got two brothers who were originally from Baghdad. They were merchants. They came to Marāghah in the 1260s, and one of them comes to the individual on the right comes to Naṣīr ad-Dīn al-Ṭūsī and gifts him some Egyptian astronomical instruments. That Egyptian is made in Egypt. But he also travels all the way to China. They're noted here as being frequent travelers, both his brother and himself. Eminent poets of the time, and whose poetry unfortunately has been lost to us. Says here that when the one on the right hand side, Kamaluddin Abul Fadl, when he traveled to China, he traveled with another individual, and he was never heard from again. Possible that he died, or he might have. There was a Persian community in Eastern China, in Hangzhou, where a mosque was built for them, which exists today, the Phoenix Mosque, as it's called. And possible that he went there, but these examples in this biographical dictionary are kind of a testament to the fact that the Mongols, as you know, Ibn Battuta, for example, the famous world traveler, that type of travel was really facilitated by the connections made by Mongol rule in the Islamic world and in China. Another traveler, for example, who became part of the intellectual environment was this individual, Izzuddin al-Hasan ibn Sheikh Muhammad al-Wasiti al-Attar, who seems to have been involved in pharmacy. So he was a druggist, al-Attar, who traveled to Khurasan and Transoxiana. He also entered the Eastern lands and China. So the Eastern lands would be, for example, Central Asia, East Turkestan, and then China would be a bit further. And he said that when he returned from traveling in the East, he went back from China through the Ilkhanate into Syria, and then he returned from Syria to Marāghah. Now, during this time, the Mongols and the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt and Syria, were engaged in quite intense warfare between the two sides, frequent warfare. But what these examples show us is that is still, even though the warfare was quite intense and frequent, it didn't disrupt the travel of intellectuals. It didn't disrupt necessarily the intellectual mobility of various scholars. Another thing that we can see in these biographical entries, interactions with the Mongol elite. So here we have Izzuddin Abul Fadl al-Hasan al-Mawsili al-Naqqash, who was a Sufi sheikh who settled in Tabriz, accompanied by his teacher, Muhyiddin Abu Muhammad Abdul Muhyi, who also has an entry in the biographical dictionary. They both stopped in Baghdad before going to Tabriz, probably looking for patronage after the conversion to Islam of the Ilkhanate ruler Ghazan. Now this Izzuddin was good in writing inscriptions and gold embroidery. Textiles were also very important for the Mongols. There's a wonderful book from 1997 by Thomas Alson called Commodity and Exchange in the Mongol Empire, which is like a social history of Islamic textiles in the Mongol world. Now, through his skills in inscription and embroidery, he became close to one of the wives of the Ilkhan Ghazan, receiving her patronage, attaining status and money, and becoming close to the other rulers and serving them. But even despite all of this, it says that he still loved the Sufis, the poor people, and the wayfaring strangers. He had a zawiya, a lodge in Tabriz that he would teach from and instruct his disciples from. And the great men, rulers, sultans would come, as well as the poor and the Gnostics. When he also produced Sufi poetry, which Ibn al-Fawti wrote down, and while he stayed with him. So all of these entries show us that even despite the Mongol conquest and the displacement of individuals at the hands of the Mongols, the scholarly community and scholarly families were what we can call islands of continuity. In fact, in this biographical dictionary, we can trace very number of generations of various families in both Marāghah and Tabriz, quite prominent families, the Ubaidi family, the Haddadi family, and the Atiqi family in Tabriz, and in Marāghah, the Marāghi family, and the Sajūsani family. Now, all of these individuals have some extant works, either that have not been studied yet, in manuscript form or recently published. For example, the Atiqi, one of the members of the Atiqi family was versed in Quranic exegesis and Sufism, and he would teach in the mosque in Tabriz, and the sermons that he gave and the lectures that he gave in Sufism have been published, I think, a few years ago by an Iranian academic publishing house. In addition, these entries also, as the previous one on Izzuddin al-Mawsili, indicate that patronage came from various sources. So the Mongol Ilkhans, the Persian administrative elite, Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī, the finance minister, and the finance minister Shamsuddin al-Juwayni, and local emirs. And one of the other things that we can do, which is quite interesting, is through tracing the biographical information, we can visualize these intellectual networks and actually just show how connected some of these individuals were with the wider intellectual community in the Islamic world. So here we have an Arabic poet and intellectual, Rashid ad-Din al-Mashhadi, who adhered to the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence, who, as you can see here, some of these names, so I won't go into too much detail about each of them. Some of these names are those of the administrative elite. Some of them are famous philosophers. One of them is his son in blue there, Abul Mahasin Yusuf. And the individual in gold is a Damascene biographer from the Mamluk realm, who included Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, Rashid ad-Din al-Mashhadi in his biographical dictionary, to the information given to him by his son, who probably traveled to Damascus. So you can see here that Rashid ad-Din al-Mashhadi is connected to the finance minister Shamsuddin al-Juwayni and his son Sharafuddin Harun, to Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī, the philosopher as well. This individual here, a second order connection, Sadr ad-Din Ibrahim Hamuway, was the Sufi scholar who administered the conversion of the Ilkhan Ghazan in 1295. Here's a member of the Atiqi family. You've got a judge here, Qāḍī Herat Fakhruddin al-Bayyari, who's connected to Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī. We have a record of this judge asking Naṣīr ad-Din al-Ṭūsī some philosophical questions, which again, unfortunately, when I tried to, it's been published, the questions have been published, but not studied, unfortunately. Interestingly enough, this Fakhruddin, because he shares his name with the famous philosopher Fakhruddin al-Razi, in one poem written by Rashid ad-Din al-Mashhadi, he compares Fakhruddin to al-Razi and says that it's as if al-Razi has been resurrected again. So it's quite high praise for this individual. Al-Mashhadi was a prolific poet who composed poetry various occasions for the rulers and friends, which unfortunately, although most of it is lost to us, his popularity and his connections serve as a testament to the intellectual vibrancy of the period. That's really the point that we can derive from this. Although in many cases we might not have the works with us for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact that most of them have just not been studied and remain in manuscript archives in Turkey, in Iran, in Germany, in Cambridge, as you'll see, in Oxford and other places. But this continuity of intellectual transmission, talking about the intellectual life of these two cities, this continuity of intellectual transmission took place in a variety of locations rather than what you would consider like a traditional madrasa or school environment. So you actually have, in the sources, we can note a number of locations, a number of sites of teaching and learning. So Marāghah itself was more than just an observatory. In fact, most of the work that went on in Marāghah was related to philosophy, quite sophisticated and advanced philosophy. Very, very interesting, or at least I find it interesting. I don't know how much others would. But you also have gatherings in mosques, madrasas, zawiyas, hanuts, inns or taverns that people would gather to recite poetry to each other, to discuss the most pressing philosophical issues and theological issues of the day. You have children's education in maktabs, and you have private and informal gatherings. On the point about Sufi zawiyas in the Mongol period appeared not just these Sufi lodges were not just places of spiritual and religious instruction, but were also places of literary learning. So for example, the Persian poet Humam ad-Din Tabrizi, his lodge, which was financed by the Juwayni family, was a place where the children of the Juwayni family, of Shamsuddin al-Juwayni and others, would study literature. So not necessarily religious Sufi poetry, but also general praise poetry and other literature. And also in this period, you have hadith transmission as well being a part of Zawiya education. So for example, there was the famous philosopher, Sufi philosopher and astronomer Quṭb al-Shīrāzī, taught hadith, transmitted hadith, prophetic narrations in his lodge in Tabriz. You also have another, an Anatolian Emir, Tajuddin Mu'taz al-Sarawi, who builds a lodge in Tabriz next to a madrasa and puts another Tabrizi Sufi as its sheikh in 1276, who taught primarily hadith from his lodge, rather than what you would consider some might be a separation between the spiritual instruction in lodges and hadith learning in madrasas. But what does seem the case is that education appears to have been less formal and institutionalized than in the Mamluk lands. Part of this could be because, as I mentioned, the Mongols, for about half of their rule over Iran, were not Muslims and didn't really have too much interest in maintaining the institutionalization of education. It could be a matter of the different intellectual environments, the Iranian intellectual environment and the Egyptian and Damascene intellectual environment. This is something that I'm still working on in my research, trying to figure out exactly why exactly the educational institutions differed. But one thing that we can also do is paint a portrait of intellectuals in this period. So you have, for example, this individual, Tajuddin al-Tabrizi, who provides a full list of his teachers and his and the subjects that he studied, which include grammar, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, legal methodology, Islamic law, geometry, astronomy, land surveying, inheritance law, etc., such that he was able to move to Cairo and become a very famous and respected scholar there. And I found out about a few weeks ago that there are actually 2 manuscripts of some of his works in Egypt, in the manuscript libraries of Egypt, which again haven't been edited or studied. I also found last week the text that he studied, possibly in inheritance law, by one of his teachers in a book called Sunnī and Tabriz. Again, this is a Persian text, hasn't been edited or studied. Now, in the period, you have a cloth madrasa set up by one of the Ilkhans, which was used to hold scholarly discussions and keep up with the nature of his court, which moved around, frequently moved. It contained 6 teachers here, prominent philosophers of the period, and was the site of intense rivalry between its teachers who debated over metaphysics and philosophy. One of those, again, whose works are mostly in manuscript form, is this individual, Badruddin al-Tustari. He's a valuable example of scholarly mobility here, because he wrote and dedicated works to the rulers of 3 different kingdoms or 3 different realms. In Anatolia, he dedicated this work here, Al-Fusul al-Ashrafiyya fil Qawaid al-Burhani, on philosophy and cosmology, to the Ashrafid ruler of Bayshahir, Mubariz ad-Din Muhammad. He was a teacher for the Ilkhanate, and he also dedicated a work on Sufism to the Mamluk Sultan al-Naṣīr Muhammad. So he's moving between each of these regions and producing works for the rulers. It's a very good example of scholarly mobility in the period that was not necessarily affected by the political situations. One of the prominent individuals, again, all of the works here remain in manuscript. This is now turning into me talking about how many works remain in manuscript form from the period, that a testament to just exactly how much we don't know about this period, about what was produced, that remains to be studied. But until someone comes along and does it, we're still going to have these notions in our mind that the period was one of intellectual stagnation and decline. So these philosophical works were endorsed. The philosophical works of the Ilkhanate Prime Minister, Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, were endorsed by around 80 scholars from the period. Unfortunately, one famous German academic dismissed these works as being of little philosophical or theological value. Now, this has resulted in that claim being repeated by about 3 or 4 other very prominent Mongol historians. I took that task of just doing a superficial overview on these works in my master's 2 years ago now. And I found that these works, it's a gold mine of information for the development of Sufism, the development of philosophy in the period. So for example, one of the works are these question and answers, which was published in 2 versions, one in 1992 by the Iran-Pakistan Institute of Persian Studies. But the main work is still in manuscript form in the Topkapi Palace, which contains 189 questions and answers to philosophical issues, theological issues, medicinal and scientific issues that really indicate the intellectual concerns of this community. So, for example, one of the questions is from the famous Ashʿari theologian Aduddin al-Iji on the liar paradox. As if a person says everything that I say is a lie, is he telling the truth or not? So he asks, even though it's been answers have been attempted by other intellectuals in the Ilkhanate, he asks the Prime Minister what he thinks, how he can answer it. Unfortunately, no one has looked at any of these treatises yet in any depth. Among the other philosophical and theological developments that you have, the emergence of new strands of intellectual thought, a synthesis of Avicennan philosophy, kalām, and Sufi metaphysics, a commentary tradition that encourages and debate and deep engagement with philosophy, and the emergence of literary Persian Sufism, epistolary debates between certain figures on philosophical issues, and which really culminates in what I will end with here, with post-Mongol Islamic philosophy. So this is a passage from Mullah Abdul Rahman Jami, who produced the Ad-Durra al-Fakhra. He says that under Sultan Muhammad Khan, the Ottoman Sultan, who wanted an adjudication between the 3 groups, the Sufis, the philosophers, and the theologians. He said that to Mullah Finari that no one was able to do this except Abdul Rahman Jami. And this culminated in Jami writing the adjudication in which he responds to those 6 questions and says that in each of them, the Sufis seem to have the right philosophical positions. So to conclude, then I hope this overview of the intellectual environment of Ilkhanate Iran has really shown you the depth of the intellectual and the vibrancy of the intellectual life. Arabic biographical dictionaries being a valuable source in reconstructing the networks, and the continued transmission and production of original works in both rational and the transmitted sciences. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
I've known Yusuf for a while now, and I knew his research was fascinating, but we never really got to speak about it. And I must say, it's truly fascinating. But my main takeaway from this is how much we genuinely don't know and haven't studied this. And that's extremely exciting. So we can start delving into it a little bit more. Do you guys have any questions at all? I mean, this is quite a niche topic. So any questions? One over here. Let me.
Lams, thank you for that really interesting talk. I have a question for you. If the great libraries of Baghdad were not destroyed by the Mongols, as we've always popularly known to have been told, A, why was it done? Why were we given this misinformation? And why has it never been corrected since?
That's a very good question. Why was it done? So it appears to have come from about 150 years later from Arab historians, from Mamluk, the Mamluk realm, for example, Ibn Khaldun and others. But it possibly could have just been claims that were popular around the time. People had the lack of information and the psychological effect of the Mongol conquests as well that resulted in some quite exaggerated claims about what they had done. This is not to say that there was absolutely no destruction of books, but there was no systematic destruction of books.
Another question?
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I have actually two questions. The first, did you find or do you find any sources telling about the existence of, for example, different religious people, elite scholars, rulers from Jewish communities, Christian, maybe Zoroaster, etc. Because I think this is very, very important in the post-Baghdad, conquest.
Yep. Yep.
And the second one, was there any, intellectual exchange between the West, Islamic West, Al-Andalus, and the East? For example, whether the people in Marāghah and also Tabriz reading the works of Ibn Rus, for example. Thank you.
Very good question. So the first one, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to put everything into it, but yeah, so we have evidence of Jewish, Christian, Buddhist communities, and a small community of Zoroastrians in Iran at this time, all conversing and engaging with one another. So, for example, one of the individuals on the page with I had the liar paradox on was a Jewish philosopher, Ibn Kamuna, who was present in Baghdad and in Marāghah. You have Buddhist scholars as well. So Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani talks about some of his debates that he had with Buddhist monks and things like that, about connections between the East and the West. One of the scholars from Marāghah was from the Maghreb, I think from around Tunisia, Muhyiddin al-Maghribi. I'm not sure about any reading of the works of Ibn Rushd, but definitely you have the transmission of works from Iran to Egypt and Egypt to Iran as well.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this very little understood here and talk about this period. I have a very specific question about something you mentioned at the beginning of the talk about how scholars were debating the philosophy of Avicennan. They were talking about commentaries written about him. But why specifically commentaries, not the original text? Was there a general trend of studying commentaries as the way to study someone's thoughts? Or, yeah, thank you.
Yep. So the commentaries were written by the scholars themselves, so they would produce commentaries on the work. And one reason is that they were teaching the works, and while they were teaching and they were giving their own comments on those works to their students would include the notes and discussions, and they would become original. They would become their own works themselves. One reason actually is quite interesting. In many cases, it's an issue of the humility of the scholar themselves, the scholar writing the commentary. Rather than writing their own work, they would prefer to comment on another text and include their own original ideas and things like that, without necessarily coming out and saying, look here, I've got my own books and my own thing. It's more of a humble commentary on the great work of another scholar. That's one of the significant reasons for the commentary tradition as well.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. Can we give him one last round of applause for his brilliant presentation today? The food at the back is served. Please help yourselves. Thank you for coming and have a lovely day. Thank you.